Ladies and gentlemen, we have an hour, more or less, to discuss the issues which could easily consume the whole day one or day two of the Warsaw Security Forum, as the NATO is such a broad sphere of themes and topics, and actually it's expanding almost every day. At the time when we meet here today in Warsaw, this is the start of the second day of the NATO minister gathering in Brussels. So what is expected today is a decision to increase the number of troops deployed in Afghanistan, the NATO troops deployed in Afghanistan from 13 to 16,000. But yesterday, as we know, NATO was discussing the changing command structure or expanding its command structure, adding a new naval base to secure communication lines across the Atlantic. So lots of things happening on the NATO side and among the NATO allied countries. I wanna start with quite a general question. We are 16 months after the Warsaw Summit and some 8 months ahead of the next summit in Brussels. Where is NATO today? How many and to what extent the decisions of Warsaw were implemented, and where are the key challenges that NATO is facing today? So perhaps, Michael, we start with you.
Sure, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think NATO is making a lot of progress on the decisions that were reached in the last summit, and it's moving ahead, particularly with the issue of speed. As we war game and we think about crisis scenarios in the European theater, it is essential for NATO to be able to reinforce troops, particularly on the eastern flank of the alliance, within our Baltic allies, potentially here in Poland, in the event of a crisis. It has to do that quickly so that we're not facing a war of liberation. And so everything that NATO is doing now, whether it's the military Schengen zone, which General Hodges, the U.S. Land Forces commander in Europe, has been advocating, or whether it's the introduction of the 2 new commands, which are not just about communications, it's about fundamentally reinforcing forward deployed American troops in Europe with reinforcements from the continental United States. All of this is geared towards creating an effective and efficient deterrent. And so I think the movement is a positive one. It is treading in the right direction. And yet there is still a lot more that needs to be done, and particularly in a couple of areas. And I will just highlight those briefly, and then we can come back perhaps in the discussion to them a little bit later. But to start out with, I want to highlight NATO really has a deficit in precision-guided munitions. And this is an issue where, as we've seen, unfortunately, with the conflict in Ukraine, Russia has a great advantage in terms of the Grad multiple rocket launch systems and the like. And so as you start thinking from a military perspective about the potential for conflict in Europe, it is vital that it's not just be United States PGMs that are deployed as part of a NATO force. Europe as well needs to have its own indigenous organic capabilities in this regard. Second major issue that needs to be focused on, which right now is the planning and the preparations are far behind the threat curve, is cyber. We've seen it time and time again. We've seen Ukrainian infrastructure taken down by Russian hackers. We've seen Russia hack into U.S. databases, voting databases in 21 states in the United States. We are well behind the curve in terms of cybersecurity and planning for a potentially crippling cyber attack. And then the last thing I'll say is that NATO really needs to get far more into the business of looking at gray zone threats. So we are very good at, we always think about the last war. So right now we're thinking about how to cope with little green men and how to deter an unconventional military operation coming from Russia into one of the NATO allies. What we're not thinking enough about is using the other methods of subversion that Russia has perfected over the course of the last few years. I'm thinking of corruption, organized crime, of course, the use of energy, which we're a little bit more familiar with, but also information warfare and some of these gray zone, as I said, covert, sometimes overt methods of subversion. Those are cheaper, easier to execute, and Russia is seeing the effect of those in my own country, as well as in countries here in Europe. And NATO, not necessarily always militarily, but NATO, or perhaps I should broaden it, the Transatlantic Alliance has to start focusing on this.
Thank you, Mike. Madam President.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think that altogether there has been considerable progress since the time I was office. I left office in 2007. Is this microphone on? Do you hear me? Yes. And I would say that not just the Warsaw Summit, but the Wales Summit before that marked a turning point where NATO became more committed, more aware, as we heard from the President just a few minutes ago, the awareness and the commitment to a realistic assessment of the situation rather than wishful thinking and hiding your head in the sand and hoping for the best that, well, if we're nice to our neighbor will be nice to us. It doesn't always work that way, so you have to be ready for a neighbor that may decide to carry a big stick, especially if they have been investing, and you know it very well, for a number of years in ensuring that that stick really carries some considerable weight. I think the Warsaw Summit marked a turning point in the sense that there was a commitment to actually do something visible on the ground. To do it for reassurance about the goodwill, the commitment, and the seriousness of the alliance, to reassert something that Russian propaganda had been trying to really very successfully spread all across the NATO community, to reassert Article 5 and its implications. Because I don't know about journalists in other countries, but the international journalists who come to Latvia and ask for an interview, for several years kept asking, well, do you think that NATO will come to your aid should you have the misfortune of being attacked? Or will they just say, well, we're not going to start a nuclear war or a third world war for some, 2 million people somewhere out there in the boondocks. We really don't know them, and who are they, and who cares? That was a very strong trend of propaganda and in various phrasings, of course, more or less elegantly or bluntly put. I have heard it from high-level politicians such as American senators and congressmen and media, high-level media representatives in Germany. And I would recommend a literary work, but a literary work by the highest European commander of NATO, the retired general, British General Sharif. He's written this charming book called War in 2017, where my country, Latvia, gets invaded. And Britain certainly considers that the occasion for absolutely, what is their first priority? How are we going to communicate among NATO countries, deploy aid and intervene? No, no, no. And this is General Sharif writing. This is not some poor scared Latvian doing that, but somebody who was #2 commander of NATO forces in Europe.
And the book is charming, Madam President, because it has a happy ending.
Well, there's that, yes, too. But the charming, in both senses of the word, ironical and real. But you see, the book shows what is General Sharif really describing. He is describing a sort of complacency into which his country's politicians had sunk. And he's using my country and spreading, if you like, disinformation about how vulnerable it is, and then, provoking any number of journalists saying, are you really scared? Do you think it really happened? And so on. He's describing how the Brits are pulling out every single British citizen out of Latvia, because God forbid they should be hit by a Russian bullet, and then Britain would have to actually engage in terms of Article 5. Well, thank you very much. That's very helpful to a member of the alliance who really takes seriously this commitment. Well, I must say that, yes, in the end, but imagine, in the book, he has to rely on the Latvian forest brothers to stand against the weapons that my colleague on the podium here has just described, that the Russians have developed. Well, you see, this is not 1945, when we had people, again, mind you, encouraged by the Russian spies working in the British Secret Services to continue resisting because Britain would come to their aid, and actually parachuting people there into the forests and asking them to assemble at a certain point so that the KGB could pick them up and neutralize them. What has happened since, I think, is that actually really visibly there has been commitment and an engagement. We have boots on the ground, we have equipment on the ground, there's military ordnances on the ground. Will that be sufficient to prevent a third world war? I think it is a serious deterrent. We have a serious deterrent, if nothing else, that is worth every cent and penny that you are spending on it.
Thank you very much. Angus.
Thank you, Mikhail, and morning, everybody. We have got to think about cyber. We've got to think about the political destabilization that Russia attempts and certainly would attempt in a bigger conflict. The military task is changing too. We are going through a review at the moment of our own defense posture, which is driven in large part by trying to work out what, even in the last 2 or 3 years, we have learnt about Russia's military capabilities and what that means for what we need in terms of capabilities to effectively deter Russia. And I think this word deter is really important, because what does deterring Russia feel like in the 21st century when you bring in these political elements, cyber, nuclear and conventional forces? So I think rethinking deterrence is at the heart of what NATO is going to have to get to grips with over the next couple of years, rethinking military capabilities and thinking about how we would actually handle the politics of a major Russian challenge to our security. Politics both in the NATO side and also on the EU side.
Thanks so much. Andrew.
Thank you very much, Michał, and thank you to Kasia and Zbyszek for inviting me to this wonderful and truly growing event. It's great to be here. Also, before I make my initial comments, since I work for the U.S. government, please make sure you understand I'm speaking in my private capacity as an analyst and not in any shape or form expressing the position of the Marshall Center or the U.S. Department of Defense. Mike has covered, I think, the key issues that relate to capabilities in the larger geostrategic context. What I'd like to do is say a few words about what I see as a political dimension of the challenge we're facing. I'm mostly concerned about 3 issues. One is what I would call the regionalization of security optics in Europe. During the Cold War, it was easy for NATO to have a shared threat assessment. It was absolutely clear if the balloon goes up, so to speak, we were all in the same boat. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been a progressive fragmentation, I would argue, in how different countries look at the overall levels of threat and the nature of the threat. We've made considerable progress, I think, since Wales and Warsaw, but if you look at the kind of very simple reality that nations live in neighborhoods, and being in Poland or being in Latvia, that neighborhood, i.e. Russia to the east, defines the security priorities of these allies. If you travel west, there's a different problem set, so to speak, that challenges countries. So if you are in Germany, if you are in France, you're gradually beginning to shift. You are aware of the problems on the eastern flank and you're concerned about them, but you're also increasingly focusing on the south. And as you know, Europe's southern border now runs through the Sahel and the MENA region. It's no longer Eastern Mediterranean or Southern Mediterranean or whatever. So those kind of differences in prioritizing, I would argue, will be a challenge going forward. And I think one of the key political challenges for the next summit will be to get our shared concept of threat perceptions and priorities closer. Second point I would make is that we are lagging on public mobilization to face the threats. And it's especially clear if you look at some of the polling data that we've had across Western Europe in particular, One of them, the most often quoted, is the Pew survey that asking the question of their sample whether in an Article 5 emergency you should actually commit to military action and go to war in defense of an ally. We're not talking about Ukraine, countries that are outside, but in defense of an ally. It was remarkable that the majority responses were negative. So in terms of the overall, what I call public mobilization for a new level of threat and the threat perceptions overall, we have some work to do. And finally, the third point, we're talking about NATO, but NATO is not in and of itself a separate entity. It exists within the overlapping structure of what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the European Union in particular, and of course, what's happening in the United States. So we are, while we're talking about capabilities, we're focusing on pledges to spend the money, how the money is spent. Let's also keep in mind that we're looking at an organization set against the background of the European Union, which is in a profound crisis. Europe still has not come to terms with the impact of the 2015-16 immigration wave. The story has barely begun. If you look at political changes that are now hitting the continent in terms of the kind of implosion of traditional political parties, the surge of new nationalist populist movements, and quite frankly in the United States, the kind of folding in, if you will, of established political parties as well, and the churning that we see. This is a larger political context we have to be very cognizant of as we're going into the next summit, because they're defining how we will actually move forward as an alliance. So in addition to those capabilities, just to close my initial remarks, let's be very much aware that this is happening in a larger transatlantic context. And I would argue we've made considerable progress. I mean, the statements and the actions from both the US side and the European side are important and they're positive. But we do have a lot of work that needs to be done, and especially when it comes to political leadership, we need to be focused on the fact that we're in the most, I think, rapidly deteriorating security environment, not just in Europe, but also globally, quite frankly, in my memory, in terms of the kind of fluidity of the challenges that are facing us. I'm not saying the risks are necessarily greater. During the Cold War, the risks were extremely high. They were truly existential. But the level of unpredictability, the fact that we're no longer in a mill-mill type of confrontation, that we're in a multi-domain environment. We've talked here at this forum about other dimensions, cyber, law, strategic communications. All these issues are creating, essentially, in my view, an imperative to rethink how the alliance deals with its legacy structures and its legacy forces. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy. Now, the view from inside the NATO structures. Robert.
Thank you very much. Great to be back here at the Warsaw Security Forum. And by the way, looking at the title, NATO, well, you can say back in business. We've never gone away anywhere. Don't worry. We really are in business. And, you know, sometimes when you get this sort of question, what have you done as organizations? Well, you kind of answer it, but, you know, you might feel deep down that you're perhaps struggling. Not a problem with that one whatsoever. Warsaw, and before that, of course, Wales. We have talked the talk and we have walked the walk. The 4 battle groups plus additional US reinforcements, of course, they're there for reassurance. They're part of our defense and deterrence posture. But to be very blunt, if need be, they're there to fight. We hope they never have to. And don't forget, please don't forget about that. This is just the most visible multinational defensive presence of NATO on the eastern flank. But of course, don't forget, there is the spearhead force. There's the response force, reaction force, which you have increased substantially. And of course, there's always the follow-up forces. NATO is well prepared when it comes to defense. Secondly, we have discussed various issues related to the type of challenges we have to address in order to make our, indeed, defense and deterrence even more credible. And some of the issues relate, for example, to the command structure. Yesterday, we heard, also in this room, some comments to the effect, well, NATO is perhaps not really discussing various things enough and so on. Well, sometimes some people say it's the opposite. we no longer discuss them, we come to the conclusions. The Minister of Defense yesterday agreed on an outline, which will mean that we'll have additional months, one dealing with the Atlantic, the sea lanes. By the way, some people say, well, but you had a similar one some years ago. You stood it down. Yes, and it made sense then. Now, it makes sense to have something there. And we'll be doing this kind of reassessment and, readjustment, because that's how we do our business. The logistic command, absolutely necessary. And you know what? It's also, I think we'll see in the coming weeks probably, this will be one of the flagship items of our cooperation with the European Union. Because if you want to have the more efficient movement of not just small things, light things, but tanks, yes, armored vehicles and others. It's about the roads, it's about the bridges, it's about standards. We need, of course, a variety of issues to be resolved. So not just ministers of defense, but ministers of transport, and as always, finance. Cyber, we've, again, decision of yesterday, Cyber Operations Center has essentially in principle been created. This is something, extremely important for us. And in Warsaw, this follows a decision where cyber domain has been defined as an operational domain. If you look at other issues, and I promise I'll stop now, but I could go on because there's a lot of this, projecting stability. We are working with partners. We are, for example, training Iraqi officers in a variety of tasks. Why? Well, NATO has formally, as an organization, joined coalition against ISIS. We've joined it with politically, of course, but we joined it with AWACS. There's an intelligence exchange. We have actually created an intelligence division at NATO itself. Last example, because again, as I say, we could go on. Famous 2% pledge. Well, if you start with Newport, where really the pledge was made, the statistics are quite good. The overall increase when it comes to defense spending on part of allies, except US, has been 4.3, which brings us collectively around 50 billion euros additional money for defense. I think this is not bad at all. More importantly, the nations are continuing this strength. So altogether, I'm not doing some sort of a, trust me, rep talk. There's lots of other examples I could give. We are in business and we are delivering on the pledges and the decisions that in a deliberate manner that now 29, last Montenegro has joined. Open door is for real as well.
Thank you, Robert. So we've already raised a huge variety of issues, I would say. Robert just said that NATO is delivering. Mike, is NATO delivering from the US perspective, from President Trump's perspective as well?
I think we've come a long way, and I think Robert has identified some of the trends and statistics with regards to defense spending. We've still got a ways to go, frankly. When I was in government, when I was in the Pentagon, I told all of my interlocutors, 2% is really a floor. We can't be in a position, particularly when allies that feel vulnerable and that are talking about the need for U.S. forces to be deployed in their countries are struggling to reach 2% at some point in the future. I mean, they should have been there long ago. So, this is the one area, probably the only area where I agree with President Trump on an important policy issue, which is that this is significant and really Europe is still far behind the curve. So they're catching up. The trend is in the right direction, but we've got a long way to go. And it's, some of these 2% pledges, well, a lot of the money is spent on personnel. Frankly, if NATO is to be prepared to deter an aggressor as capable and as effective that has gone through 10 years of military modernization for real over the last decade as Russia has, then we need to be investing not just in personnel and pensions, we need to be investing in new capabilities. I alluded to that in terms of cyber and precision-guided munitions. We need to look at space capabilities. And this is where really the alliance relies almost entirely on the United States. And we absolutely have to invest in new capabilities that are based here in Europe to have that deterrence more effective. So, I agree with Robert. I think, you can look at this and it's certainly glass half full the way I see it as well. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a long ways to go. And, you know, we shouldn't get complacent. Again, as I said, 2% when you're facing a threat of a potential invasion, as you are, let's face it, as you are in Poland, as you are in Latvia, as, you know, some of the other Baltic states are. 2% is not enough. I mean, look at Greece and Turkey. They're spending, you know, 4 or 5%. So yes, things are moving in the right direction, but we've got a long way to go.
Thank you. Madam President, NATO started talking about the infrastructure, about roads, bridges, rail connections. We are talking about the military Schengen zone, yes, as General Hodges mentioned this. How important this factor is, and would it be actually easier for the European allied countries to address these issues than military expectations, military challenges, military goals and objectives in the current situation?
I would say the question of defense has to find its place in each country's agenda with a full understanding on what it means to have a defense capability and how it fits in with the rest of the program. Because the strength of the alliance rests on its capabilities and military ability to deliver military force. But that strength, in turn, needs a political commitment. And here is the first challenge. I do see in Europe a trend of propaganda that keeps saying, well, what is that money being spent on? Are we just supporting the military-industrial complex? Is it that somebody needs to sell arms to some poor countries that actually should be investing more money in their education? How good is their health system and their pension system? How are they looking after their citizens? And what is this? You see, spending on defense, because it is a deterrent and a preparation for an eventuality, is then put against the real, actual needs of health, of education, and everything else that the daily life, of course, of citizens demands from those who are governing them. What the nation-state is able to deliver to its citizen. And the nation-state, for those countries that are part of the alliance, really has to put as a high priority, I think, communication, and I do see that happening, and the necessity for it, communication with the population to prepare the ground for political decisions that will sound reasonable. Otherwise, people are saying, well, why do we need to spend money on defense? Germany, for instance, for a long time you said Germany was meant to be kept down, but the Germans are very happy to keep down their defense spending. I mean, why waste money on it? Let the Americans do it for us. And I think this is what, to some extent, I find myself, to my surprise, agreeing with Mr. Trump on that. Yes, I think that Europe needs to think more seriously about its own investment in its defense capability and to do something about it, not just talk about it. But I'm also concerned, not so much about bridges and roads as the willingness to deploy something should the need arise. And here, the time it takes for a decision to be made at the military level, I do believe is rather on the long side. I think it should be seriously shortened so that the decision-making chain, the chain of command, which leads to some intervention on the part of NATO as NATO, should be shortened. And yes, of course, I mean, it's not just a matter of having a country that has bridges where they should be and roads where you need them, but if you have a neutral country sitting in the middle of the European continent and saying, well, we do have a priority, and that is our holiday makers who are returning from their holidays on the 1st of July and 1st of August, and and we cannot have, it doesn't matter to us as a neutral country. If some country happens to be attacked in that period, and you happen to need to pass through our country in order to get there, we have a firm commitment to our holidaymakers so that they shouldn't be sitting too long on the roads, and you cannot use our roads. I think that here again, I think it's political dialogue more than the existence of the roads that is necessary. In other words, the roads are there, but the permission to use them is something else. I'm very happy to see that this awareness of the need to shorten the chain of command, the need to have a logistics, the need for Europeans, and I've sat on a number of commissions, small reflection groups about the defense capabilities of Europe. Even way back when I was vice chairman of the reflection group on the future of Europe, we kept saying Europeans and the European Union needs to have more collaboration in terms of military procurement, in terms of rationalization of how many types of tanks they are producing. It is wasteful. The compatibility of ordnance with weapons is actually, there are weird things happening there as well. When Mike said that there's lots to be done, I think it's all too true. But I'm happy to add that I see it happening. And once, I think it's sort of a huge inertia that we had for a long time. What has Johnny Boy done for us lately? Why do we need NATO? We are so secure. We don't have any enemies. We're just fine. Let's just, save money, spend it, eat, drink, and be merry. I'm not against that. I enjoy eating, drinking, and being merry. But one also has to prepare for the rainy day. And I think that is being done, and I'm happy to notice that it is being done.
Thanks so much. Angus, the UK just announced the deployment of 4 Typhoons to Romania next year. I believe I need to ask you about Brexit, I'm afraid. Even here, even during this discussion, if Brexit, how and if Brexit would actually influence your NATO relations, your defense activities in the region, especially in the East flank. Obviously, we have to ask about that.
Sure. Well, that's a perfectly fair question. Look, I mean, ever since the vote to leave the European Union, the British government has made very clear that, especially when it comes to security, we're leaving the EU, we're not leaving Europe. And quite frankly, you only have to look at a map to see that if we'd reached a different policy conclusion, we would need our heads examining. We cannot leave Europe. Britain has always been an integral part of European security, and it will have to remain so. And it's what I think the overwhelming majority of our political class support. Now, what does that mean? I think it means that we have to invest more in a number of key bilateral relationships on defence issues in Europe. I think that was happening anyway. It would have happened even without Brexit, because if the way in which you generate, especially high-end capabilities, just the sheer cost of it means that most of the time you're going to have to do it in collaboration with other partners. So bilateral relationships will be a big part of this, and it's one of the reasons I'm in Warsaw today. Secondly, we will try or we will offer to maintain an operational relationship with the European Union itself on defence, especially when it comes to capability development. Whether the other European nations will want that, we don't know yet, but I think it's certainly a possibility. But I think it does mean that we will focus even more on NATO. Again, I think this was a trend that was coming, and it was driven by Russia rather than European politics. But I think we will invest more politically in terms of people and resource in NATO than perhaps we had done over the last 10, 15 years, when our military focus was very much expeditionary warfare in the Middle East. So I think for all sorts of reasons, NATO has come closer to the centre of gravity of what British defence thinking is about at every level, political and military. And I do agree very strongly with what the last 2 speakers have said about complacency. I mean, defence spending in Europe is a difficult question. almost all European countries, except perhaps Germany, are still basically dealing with the financial consequences of the financial crisis we faced in 2008, 2010. It means nobody has enormous amounts of money that they can prioritize towards defense. But actually, a lot of European countries are beginning to make that effort, and we shouldn't be complacent. We have to go further, but we should recognize that a shift has started.
Thanks so much. Andy, I want to ask you about the future expansion of the NATO. We were all listening to the Georgian President Margvelashvili this morning, and there's a clear appetite and obvious ambition of Georgia to join the family. Do you see, realistically, do you see a scope and appetite of the NATO to have a further expansions beyond the Montenegro, which happened just a couple of months ago?
Let me actually kind of course correct on one thing. I'm struck that the term NATO expansion has entered the vocabulary of debates on NATO enlargement. NATO expansion has been a term that the Russians put on the table specifically because of what it connotes. It connotes a hostile act of trying to get into a sphere of influence, get to your borders. When we were beginning this process, I remember in the 1990s, the preferred term was NATO enlargement, to send the message that we're talking about expanding a sphere of enlarging the sphere of democratic space, market, security, and so forth. So my plea to everybody, and I have colleagues who write on this, please don't use the Russian-derived term NATO expansion. Please go back to the old term NATO enlargement. I think it does send a certain message that's important. Now, to your question, I don't think in near term we can talk about Georgia or Ukraine, the elephant in the room, getting into the alliance for a variety of reasons, but one of them being the simple fact that these countries have open conflicts, whether they're frozen or not frozen, however you want to debate that. And I find it very hard to imagine that the alliance would undertake a decision to bring these states into the fold. That doesn't mean that this process is foreclosed, but I think that under the present, in the present environment, it would take a lot to get to the consensus required to get these states in. I want to make one more point because I think it goes to some of the issues that were raised here about what NATO is doing. I think it's terrific that we're making commitments to spend money. I think it's terrific we're talking about buying some hardware. But we now, and quite frankly, if somebody had told me a few years ago that you would have American soldiers in Poland, American tanks, and if you would have multinational NATO units in the Baltic states, this is huge progress. I mean, what Warsaw delivered is truly remarkable in the context of the whole post-communist transformation and developments. But this is deterrence by tripwire. I mean, let's make absolutely no bones about this, in my view, which means reinforcement is key. So it's not just what you buy, but how you exercise these capabilities. If you don't exercise these capabilities, it's vaporware, quite frankly. It's more of a theoretical conversation. The Russians have shown us that they can mobilize thousands of troops in very short time frames. We're talking 48 to 72 hours. For people who spend some time at NATO headquarters, that's a waking up period for some ambassadors, when it comes to a long weekend. I'm not being facetious here without purpose. I think we need to give SACEUR more capability to make decisions. I think we need to exercise capabilities when it comes especially to the areas that are of great concern. I'm talking about the Kaliningrad A2AD bubble. I'm also talking about what the Russians are doing in Crimea, parts of Eastern Mediterranean. These capabilities have not only have to be in place, they have to be exercised. And we also need to preposition stocks and exercise actually how we would reinforce in the extreme situation the troops that we have now in place. And I think if we do move from simply buying more stuff, buying more capabilities, to actually exercising that capability in a way that sends an unequivocal message to the Russians, should they cross the tripwire, this is what would follow. I think deterrence would be much more effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Ladies and gentlemen, we have like 12 minutes remaining until the end of the session. I think Roland was first to raise the question. Do we have mics in the room? Gentleman here in the front row, please. Yes.
Thank you, Michał. I'm Roland Freudenstein from the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies in Brussels, and I admit I'm German, but I'm going to ask a very un-German question about the NATO-Russia Council and what I would call dialogue fetishism. So you see where this is going. Now, I mean, there's a couple of purposes that I can imagine for the Council to still exist. One is, you know, to prevent incidents or prevent incidents from developing into war, especially on the seas and in the air. Another one would be to maintain unity among the member states. You know, it's just the other side of the coin of the different military measures that have been taken. But there would be one purpose, which actually many of my fellow Germans would probably put forward, saying as long as, I mean, I'm summarizing it, as long as we talk, we don't shoot. Now, by the moment this statement is made, the shooting usually has been going on for quite some time, just not by the West or NATO or the United States. And then there's a fourth reason to strike the grand bargain. Well, that's probably beyond the reach of the NATO-Russia Council. But would maybe one of the politicians enlighten me, why do we still have the NATO-Russia Council after everything that's happened in the last couple of years?
Thank you, Roland, for that. We have a gentleman here. May I have the mic jumping quickly? Yes. Thank you.
I am a Sciences Po professor in Paris, so I will ask a very French question. I think we all agree in this room that NATO has to deter every kind of threat, multidimensional threat. There's one threat which I have not heard about in this room, which is the nuclear threat, which was revived by Putin in Ukraine not so long ago. Now we have in Washington in the Congress a discussion about the violation of the INF Treaty and what to do about that, and especially what to do about reinforcing nuclear means in Europe. So my question is, do you think it will affect the next NATO summit? And is there a risk of division, or at the contrary, a reaffirmation, which has been always the same, that NATO is also a nuclear alliance?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anders, here. Yes. Yes, please. And then...
Thank you very much. Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. My questions is primarily for Mike Carpenter, and that is the US attitude to EU cooperation in defense. President Vicky Freiberger mentioned the topic of Europe needing to have what is really a single market for armament. As it is now, each country works for itself, for its own military, in a highly inefficient way for military procurement. But the US is primarily interested in selling US military equipment. That's one area. The other is what EU activities in defense are desirable, when are they competitive with NATO, and from a US perspective, therefore, undesirable. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. We have gentlemen in the back. Two more questions, and then we're going to combine our answers.
Walter Purcell, York University, Canada. You've made two references to speed. What is the real plan to reconcile, on the one side, a party that has unity of command versus an organization that requires a committee to make a decision? The gap in speed is fatal if it is not resolved.
Thanks so much. And here, the front row, and then we... Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Marcin Buissines from the Pulaski Foundation. Two quick questions. One, the joint declaration of EU and NATO from Warsaw. Where is it? Where is its implementation? How the U.S. administration is looking at that cooperation, and how is NATO and Brussels looking at it? That's one question. The second question is defense, collective defense versus external engagement. We've just had the decision to send, I think, 3,000 additional NATO staff to Afghanistan. Something we're, well, seeing again and probably making the same mistake again. I'm very curious about your views and ideas on that and where it's going to lead us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike, you wanna start?
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'll try and be brief here. So on external engagement, you know, I'm a critic of plussing up the NATO commitment in Afghanistan. I think now, you know, 16 years on, we've seen that the Taliban is resurgent. We've seen that Russia is arming the Taliban. We've seen that the Afghan national forces are really only able to extract a stalemate on the ground and are not capable of truly defending their own territory in a robust way. I think, you know, my boss, Joe Biden, in 2009 argued we needed to have a slimmed down counterterrorism mission led by the United States, primarily in Afghanistan. I think he was right then. I think he's right now. I think that's what we need. I think we've wasted tremendous resources in Afghanistan, but that's my personal view. You know, getting to the questions of a couple people asked about EU-NATO cooperation, you know, there's a lot to be done between NATO and the EU. I mean, aside from the defense market, which is more of a commercial issue, and here I think you get into a little bit of a tension between U.S. suppliers and European suppliers. But, you know, frankly, there's a lot of room for collaboration, particularly on the gray zone threats. So when you're looking at cyber, for example, there's a role for the EU to play, because a lot of cyber vulnerabilities are faced by private sector companies that manage and own critical infrastructure. And so there you have a lot of scope for the EU to be involved alongside NATO. And frankly, that goes for all of the gray zone threats, whether it's money laundering, corruption, organized crime. Those are not military, qua-military threats per se. They need some sort of common approach between NATO and the EU. And then quickly to the question of speed, of course, I agree. You know, I think a lot of people actually misunderstand exactly how this works in practice. SACEUR does have a lot of authorities that are pre-delegated, but I do agree that we do need to look at this more carefully. He has to have more authority to be able to deploy forces in the event of a conflict before the NAC is able to make a decision. I still have confidence in the NAC. I think, you know, if we get to a crisis situation, you know, I think they can act quickly, but I understand fully why people would have skepticism. We saw, especially in the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia, that the NAC was ineffective. And so unfortunately, that example lasts with us till today. And so we need to get at this issue seriously. And then if I could, just 30 seconds on the enlargement, which is the correct term because it's the aspirants who desire enlargement. It's not the expansion. It's not driven from Brussels. It's driven by aspirants. But on this question, we talk a lot about Georgia and Ukraine. Please, let's not forget the Western Balkans. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity right now, and I don't mean to over-exaggerate this, but to finally bring Macedonia into the alliance. The Greeks and the Macedonians under the Zaev government are talking seriously about a resolution of the name issue. This would be critically important to the region. It would bring in a country that has gone through something like 21 map cycles without finally getting membership. Let's get this done. And let's also remember that, at least to me, the greatest vulnerability in European security right now is Russian intervention and meddling in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Let's not forget about the Balkans. We talk a lot, because we're in Warsaw, about this region, North Central Europe. We talk a little bit about the Black Sea with the Georgian president. Let's not forget the Balkans.
Thanks so much. Madam President, you want to address one of these issues, perhaps?
Just a brief, a few words about the NATO-Russia Council. I remember when Lord Robertson was Secretary of NATO, how proud he was. He said, "I'd never dreamt in my whole life that I would see Russia sitting at the same table between Portugal and Spain, alphabetically. But at the same time, a few years later, him remarking that one of his biggest time wasters in his agenda was the NATO-Russia Council, because it was quite evident that the only aim that Russia had on its agenda was to stall anything and to interfere as much as possible in common decisions that would be to the benefit of the alliance. And so that I think the practicalities of dialogue with Russia are always there, and I appreciate the remark saying that we do not want to have misunderstandings leading to conflict. But we also have to be aware of the fact that for instance, incursions into Baltic airspace that we have regularly been seeing from Russia have lasted for years. Italy has, I think, fewer incursions into its airspace from foreign unrecognized objects, not necessarily UFOs, you know. But we have these regular incursions. We've had them for years, and I'm sure that the Russian forces have a nice map where they have precisely to the millisecond displayed how many minutes and seconds it takes for the NATO planes that are standing there, the patrols in Lithuania, to actually reach any plane and any part of the perimeter of the Baltic states. And that is a deliberate action. These are deliberate incursions. They are done with a purpose. They're done with the purpose of intimidating. They're done with the purpose of getting actually military intelligence. And they also have certain political implications in terms of what follows, you know, and how does the West react to this. I think the West has to show that it is not sleeping, that it's not snoring away, but awake, aware, ready to react, and ready to talk, all at the same time.
Thank you, Madam President. Angus, the nuclear threat?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. NATO is a nuclear alliance, and I think we don't recognize that enough. It's actually one of the reasons that we invited the NAC and the military committee to visit Faslane, where the UK deterrent is based, just a couple of weeks ago. And I think, you know, on issues like the INF, we are going to have to call out Russia. And I think this is the answer to your question about, you know, what is the point of having a NATO-Russia Council? Actually, it's a format in which you call them out. It's a format in which you say, we know what you're doing, and we're watching you, we will respond. And I think that's important, because I think if you go back to what the President of Georgia was telling us, talking to us about earlier, you know, we went through a long period of not calling Russia out over what they were doing. So I think those sort of formats are useful. Just very quickly, I mean, I think, you know, one thing I didn't say on Brexit earlier, but I think it is quite important in terms of the conversation we've just had. You know, one of the roles the UK has always played within the EU has been to ask the really tough questions about whether something the EU was doing in defence was really compatible with what NATO was doing. And when we leave, other member states are going to have to step up and ask those tough questions. Because EU-NATO complementarity, how we would take decisions in a crisis, how we would take fast, meaningful decisions, is really tough. And the risk is that at both sides of Brussels, and I've worked on both sides of Brussels, you just get locked into a self-referential decision-making loop, which doesn't allow you to understand what's going on in capitals, let alone what's going on the other side of Brussels. So I think that's tough, and somebody's got to pick up the British baton.
Thanks so much. And Robert, your last comments, just briefly.
Okay, very briefly, Mike has already said about the role that the Secure has to play. I'd like to also add to this very clear authorities for commanders on the ground in those units that are deployed in the Baltics and in Poland. And let me add one more important point here. It's not just when the decision is made, what follows the decision, how quickly can it be executed. And what that means, once again, keep in mind, Germany remains the key entry point for U.S. Army into Europe. Right, that's where most of the infrastructure still is. What that means is that we need free access to rail, we need complete freedom of movement in the event the decision is made and reinforcement has to be executed. And quite frankly, we dismantled a lot of that infrastructure in the post-Cold War era. For obvious reasons, we were not anticipating threats. All of this has to be rebuilt, so I keep coming back, logistics, logistics, and logistics. Once that's in place, if the decision is made, then the cycle between the decision and the actual action will be short.
It's only the second time I get the floor, so I quickly, 3 quick points. NATO-Russia Council. It's not really a pleasure to sit for all those meetings, and I do sit in them, but it has to be done. Why is it done? Has to be done because that is essentially collective wisdom of the allies. We have defense and deterrence on one side, but the second part of our approach is dialogue. And we need to have it because we don't want to have, you know, the fighter planes being shot down like over the airspace of Turkey. It happened. We don't want some accidents to sort of turn into something serious. And yes, as Angus said, it's a great opportunity, like we do with Zapad. We found out a lot of interesting things, including huge discrepancies between what has been briefed to us, and for instance OAC, and what has actually happened. So it is an important forum, and we'll continue be using it, even, to be honest, it's not always such a great pleasure to listen to various things that we hear. Second point, the INF, again, this is yesterday. Secretary of Defense Mattis briefed allies about what US considered to be violations. And as the Secretary General said yesterday at his press conference, well, we do hope, all allies hope, that Russia will take those concerns very, very seriously. Because allies do want to preserve those regimes. We don't want to go back, some people may remember this, through Pershing's, SS-20s. This, we've done away with that. So again, Russia is actually now, if you like, officially been asked by all the allies, please, you know, honor the commitments you've taken. And NATO-EU. The question of what is that we're doing has been answered first. There was a joint declaration made in Warsaw, but it was followed by unprecedented joint document elaborated by the staffs of the respective organizations, 42 of them. And we're implementing as we speak. Western Balkans was mentioned. Absolutely. We have the same goals. We have tools, you know. You will see some interesting developments, I'm sure. But for instance, on the issue of cyber, this is one of the top areas. You have the Secretary General participating in an exercise, decision-making exercise, together with the EU defense ministers, and vice versa. We have hybrid, the same thing. Again, as we call it, from tweets to tanks. And we're addressing it together. So the list is long, and we'll see. But the point is that we do not believe that the variety of challenges that we are facing can be addressed by the other organization alone. We have to work together, and the truth is that we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So definitely NATO is not back in business. It is busy in business, and it's ready for the further enlargement, not the expansion, as you rightly corrected me. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, we have to wrap up. So please join me in thanking our panelists.